What's up, world? I'm Cameron McKinney, and this is Pop Culture Spotlight, a podcast about the movie Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. Here's a quick synopsis. After his life is killed, Edgin Darvis turns to a life of thievery and is arrested, attempting to go after a magical tablet to bring her back to life, and after a year in prison, escapes and with a group continues his quest to get his family back. The film stars Chris Pine, Michelle Rodrigues, Justice Smith, Hugh Grant, Sophia Lillis, Rege-Jean and Chloe Coleman standout performances. I have heard many people wonder why Chris Pine isn't making more serious movies, why he isn't in more award caliber winning films, which he was. Pine starred in Hell or High Water, which he was great in, and when I watch him, I don't have those same thoughts. I view Pine as a movie star who should be the lead of these bigger films. He's a perfect leading man who gets you invested in his characters, and he's done it time and time again. He of course played Captain Kirk in the J.J. Abrams Star Trek films, Steve Trevor in the two Wonder Woman movies. I'll never understand what they did to his character in Wonder Woman 1984. I understand wanting to see Pine work with great filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino or Martin Scorsese, but that shouldn't take away from what he does in movies like Dungeons & Dragons. He's really funny in the film, and I realized he was funny after seeing him in Horrible Bosses 2, which was co-written by John Francis Daley and Jonathan Goldstein, the writer and directors of Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. Pine might not be the biggest movie star in the world, but he is in fact a movie star who seemingly is not chasing Oscars and would rather show up in a crowd-pleasing movie like this, and he delivers in big studio films. In Dungeons & Dragons, he plays Edgin, a man who has lost everything due to the fact that he wanted to have a better life. Pine is that rare leading man who doesn't ever get overshadowed by other people's performances. There are also just some actors who are better at making mainstream movies than these films that win Oscars. I look at a guy like Will Smith. Will Smith, to me, is way better in mainstream movies like Men in Black or Independence Day than any of those movies where he's chasing the Oscar. The same for a guy like Keanu Reeves. When you think of Keanu Reeves, you think of The Matrix, you think of the action movies he's made. He's the lead of John Wick. He's not the lead of these movies that are chasing Oscars. Keanu Reeves is a mainstream actor. He's the guy known for starring in Speed. That's the kind of actor Chris Pine is, and that's not a bad thing. Not everyone is going to win an Oscar in their career. Pine has chosen the career path that best suits him. Pine is set to make his directorial debut with the movie Pool Man, co-starring Annette Bening and Ariana DeBose. In recent years, I have become a big fan of Justice Smith. The actor has mastered the art of being comedic relief and the sidekick character in big blockbuster films. He's one of the only bright spots in Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom, and I really enjoyed him in Pokemon Detective Pikachu. In Dungeons & Dragons, he plays Simon, a sorcerer who lacks self-confidence. He's hilarious in the movie, and I really like the dynamic between his character and Doric, played by Sophia Lillis. I could watch an entire movie with just those two. For me, Justice was the best part of Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. He's a young actor who I will continue to keep an eye on. Like, he's just so good at acting in these kind of big blockbustery movies. You want to see him paired with Chris Pratt. You want to see him paired with Chris Pine. I would love to see Justice Smith in a Marvel movie. Like, he just fits in that kind of sense of humor. He plays these characters like a fish out of water. Like, you just love seeing him interact with these giant spectacles. Like, you love seeing him as a sorcerer. You love seeing him against dinosaurs. Like, I love to see Justice Smith in these big blockbuster films. You love to see him interacting with Pokemon. Like, he's that kind of actor. He really gives it his all in these type of films, and I think he's underrated because these movies don't get appreciated, but I love what he does in them, and I think he's largely the best part of all three of these films I've mentioned. He's the best part of Jurassic World: Fallen Kingdom. He's the best part of Pokemon Detective Pikachu, and he's the best part of Dungeons & Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. He reminds me in a way of like a Michael Pena type. Like, when you watch Michael Pena in Ant-Man, he's not the lead character, but he steals steals that movie, and Justice Smith does the exact same thing in these big blockbuster films like Dungeons and Dragons. He completely steals the movie. Smith will next star in the horror movie I Saw the TV Glow. I am someone who has not watched even 5 minutes of a Fast and Furious movie, and because of that, I only became aware of Michelle Rodrigues after seeing her in Steve McQueen's Widows with Viola Davis and in the thriller Crisis with Gary Oldman, and thought she was fantastic in both movies. In Dungeons and Dragons, she plays Olga, a really cool barbarian, and is the best part of the movie's action sequences. She and Pine have really good chemistry. She is such a believable action star. Like, get her in a Marvel or a DC movie ASAP. She was born for this type of action. Rodrigues will, of course, be in the final 2 movies of the Fast and Furious franchise. I also did not watch Rege-Jean Page in the hit Netflix series Bridgerton, and the first time I saw him was in The Gray Man and was not really impressed. I was not impressed with that movie at all. I didn't think he worked in that movie at all. And then I watched this movie, and in Dungeons and Dragons, his character appears in the middle of the movie and he makes a real impact, and that's not easy to do. To be interesting with very little screen time is rare, and the fun thing about his character Zenek is how he doesn't understand the humor of the rest of the group. I now understand why everyone thinks this guy is going to be the next big thing. Page's next project is a TV adaptation of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid with Glenn Powell, and that's super interesting. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, starring Paul Newman and Robert Redford, is a brilliant movie. It's a classic, and trying to modernize it sounds risky, to say the least. Also, whenever people talk about who should be the next Bond, Page's name gets brought up, and yes, I could see that. And if he were chosen to play Bond, I would want the franchise to go back to being more fun and silly. Page would not work in a dead, serious Bond movie like the Daniel Craig-led ones. And finally, this is an excellent use of Hugh Grant in the film. He plays a con man, and I couldn't help but think when I was watching, Grant in the 90s could have played the lead of this movie. Grant has made a great transition from leading man to supporting actor. Grant next has roles in Unfrosted, a movie about Pop-Tarts directed by Jerry Seinfeld, and The Palace, a mini-series co-starring Kate Winslet and Andrea Riseborough. The writer-directors of Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves are John Francis Daley, who as an actor is best known for being in Freaks and Geeks and Bones, and Jonathan Goldstein. The two have previously directed the much-maligned Vacation starring Ed Helms and the critical hit Game Night, which many people believe to be the last great studio comedy starring Jason Bateman and Rachel McAdams. They also co-wrote Horrible Bosses and Spider-Man Homecoming, and they brought that same sense of humor in those comedies to Dungeons and Dragons, and it was much needed because absolutely no one would want to see a Dungeons and Dragons movie that took itself way too seriously. It's worth noting Daley and Goldstein were going to direct the upcoming Flash movie, but left the project over creative differences with star Ezra Miller, and this was the perfect replacement project because Dungeons and Dragons is bigger than any other movie they made and plays to their strengths, which is humor and making the best use of a huge ensemble cast. What I enjoyed about this movie is you did not need to be a big fan of the game Dungeons and Dragons to like and enjoy it. Make no mistake, this is a mainstream film, and I'm sure there are references to the game that went over my head. So if you don't want to see this movie because you think it will be too nerdy, it's not. It's a movie for everyone. You're going to enjoy Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. One thing that has annoyed me about this movie has been all the talk about this becoming a franchise. Of course, the studio wants this film to be a gigantic success and for them to make more movies. And why critics and others are annoyed by this is because of Marvel. And I'll admit, there are some similarities between this movie and superhero movies. However, this is better than most recent comic book films. And after seeing this movie, I would be perfectly perfectly fine seeing more Dungeons and Dragons on screen. The characters were good, the plot was interesting, and I also like the look of the movie. It felt like the movie took place in a real world. It's not like a lot of films that are filled with terrible CGI. I get that franchise has become a dirty word and usually end up with bad sequels being made, and that might happen with this film, but at the end of the day, movie studios are in the business of making money, and that's never going to change, so let's not be upset by it. Worst case scenario is they make a very bad sequel and then the franchise dies. Like, I don't understand the anger about a movie being made. Who cares if the studio wants to turn this into a franchise? Who cares if this movie makes a ton of money? It's not stopping other movies from being made. It's good for the business that movies like Dungeons and Dragons do well, because it means that these actors can go on to do other projects, maybe to you more interesting projects. If this franchise becomes a huge hit, maybe it has Chris Pine make those movies you want him to do and helps him become an Oscar-winning actor like all of you pretend you want him to be. Like, it could only be a good thing for this movie to be successful. There's no downside. So what if you get a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons movies? You don't have to see them. And there have been plenty of franchises throughout my life that I largely ignored. I have still not seen one Twilight movie. I've only seen 2 of the Transformer films of like the 7 that they made. I saw Bumblebee after that, but I stopped seeing Transformer movies. Who cares if they continue to make these franchise movies? If you want to see them, you can go see them. That's how I feel about the Marvel movies in general right now. If you're still a fan of them, go out and see them. I'm done with the movies, but I'm not out here wanting them to stop making them because it doesn't affect me. All the anger about this becoming a franchise and for people seeing this movie, even though you might not like it, I just don't understand all the talk around that. Who cares if they make this a franchise or not? I mean, I hope they make it a franchise and I hope they continue to make movies, but I'm realistic. In reality, there's probably only going to be about 2 really good Dungeons and Dragons movies, and then by the third one, I'll probably sick of it too. But who cares? Who was affected by them making that third movie? It doesn't bother me of these franchises. Of course, the studios are seeking franchises because you don't know what's going to be a hit movie anymore. And because of that, these studios are bringing back franchises like The Hunger Games because they know that The Hunger Games is a surefire hit, and at least the first of those Hunger Game prequels is going to be a hit. Studios are looking for surefire hits, and if Dungeons and Dragons becomes one of those, then guess what? They're going to make a franchise out of it, but it's not going to affect you in any positive or negative way. If you like the movies, it's a good thing. You can enjoy them. If you don't like this movie and don't want to see the story moving forward, just ignore the movie. It's okay to ignore a franchise. I've been ignoring many of them for a while now. You get used to it. There are some mainstream movies that you just don't understand why they are mainstream movies. And when I see those type of movies, I don't get upset that they're being made. And I also have an understanding that movies like Dungeons and Dragons are trying to please the most amount of people possible, and that's what this is doing. And I think it's doing that while also being entertaining. This movie, a movie like this, is never going to be a masterpiece. It's never going to be one of your top 5 movies of all time, but it can still be good, and I think this movie is very good for what it is. And I feel the same way about it as I do like a Ryan Reynolds movie like Free Guy. That movie is just there to please you and be entertaining, and that's exactly what it does. The movie does exactly what it's attempting to do. Therefore, I think of these movies as successes. Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves is a success in my mind. And it fared well at the box office, making just under $40 million domestically. To put that in perspective, there was a Dungeons and Dragons movie in 2000 that only made $33 million overall. And if it continues to do well at the box office, then yes, you will probably see Dungeons and Dragons become a franchise. You could see Rege-Jean get his own movie. You could see a lot of these characters break off and get their own movies. You will probably see Chris Pine play this character again. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I grew up in an era where there were some really fun franchise movies. The Pirates of the Caribbean films. Every time I watched one of those movies, I enjoyed it. You got to see Keira Knightley play the same character over and over again. Those movies weren't masterpieces, but they were blockbusters and they were fun. I'll also say this. I think there's this weird thing with movie criticism lately that different equals good. Like if a movie is different than any movie you've ever seen, then that means it's better than something that reminds you of something else. I'll admit to this. Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves, you will watch this movie and it will remind you of other movies you have seen, but that doesn't take away how good of a movie it is. It is a quality film that is well made. It doesn't mean it's any worse than a movie that's more original than it. Originality does not necessarily mean a movie is better than another movie. I feel like sometimes being different gets rewarded more than being good. Dungeons and Dragons is good. I was hesitant going into this movie because I thought it was going to be overly complicated and you were going to have to understand the game to understand the movie. And I also have this thing with fantasy movies. I think fantasy is one of the hardest genres of movies to adapt. Like Lord of the Rings, what's so great about those movies, it's how almost impossible it is to make that a mainstream thing. Like so many people enjoy Lord of the Rings, even though it's a super complicated set of books that not everyone has read, but that has become mainstream, and I think that's why it succeeded. That film, Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, won Best Picture. Like that movie is the ultimate success story when it comes to a franchise based on fantasy, but sometimes fantasies can go in the opposite direction. They can become too complicated, too hard for the audience to understand. I'm not saying that audiences are dumb and don't understand these movies, but sometimes when it comes to a fantasy movie, you don't fully invest in them, and you can really invest in Dungeons and Dragons because they simplified the story. It's not overly complicated. Like Chris Pine is playing a simple character with relatable problems. He wants to be with his family. Yes, there's a magical item involved, but the story is more around the main characters. This is a character-driven movie, and that's when these fantasies become mainstream, when you invest in the characters. You invest in the Simon character played by Justice Smith. You invest in Chris Pine's character. You invest in Michelle Rodrigues. I believe it's when the magical elements of these fantasy stories become secondary is when these movies become successes. Like The Lord of the Rings is a success because those movies are about that friendship between Frodo and Sam. Like that became a mainstream thing. That's a simple thing. That movie is complicated. Lord of the Rings is complicated if you think about it, but it's simplified when you think about it as about a movie about friendship. And with Dungeons and Dragons, it becomes simplified when it becomes a man just trying to get his family back. I mean, I'm somewhat interested to see if the diehard fans of Dungeons and Dragons are going to be fans of this movie, because I don't know how loyal it is to the game. I just know that it's a movie that's easy to understand. It's got a really good sense of humor. You want to spend time with the characters, and overall, I didn't know what to expect from a movie about Dungeons and Dragons because, again, fantasy is a hard genre of film, and when they don't work, they really don't work, and for the most part, this movie works. Yeah, maybe you can criticize it for being overly simple, but rarely are big studio films complicated. At the end of the day, I enjoyed spending time with these characters as a group, and I wouldn't be mad spending more time with them. So if this becomes a franchise, I would definitely watch a sequel to Dungeons and Dragons Among Thieves. If this was a one-off, it's a good enough one-off for me. Like, I enjoyed the experience way more than I thought I was going to. It's a better movie than I thought I was going to see going in. I really like this movie and hope it does well at the box office. I would like at least one Dungeons and Dragons Dragons sequel. I'm sure, again, by the third movie, I'll be sick of this if it becomes a franchise, but I would like to see a sequel. I really like the Chris Pine character, and I want to see more Justice Smith as Simon. I'm not joking when I say that this is one of my favorite young actors right now. He is so good in these kind of blockbuster films, and I want to see him more than just the comedic sidekick. I would love to see him get his own movie as the Sorcerer Simon. And I'll say this one last time, take my word, you do not need to be a fan of the game Dungeons and Dragons to enjoy this movie. This is about as mainstream as a movie can get. If you enjoy big studio films with movie star actors, you're going to like Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Thanks for listening to this edition of Pop Culture Spotlight. I'm Cameron McKinney, and there'll be a new episode of the podcast every Thursday on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I highly recommend you check out Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Next week on the podcast, I'm talking about the movie Air, starring Matt Damon, Ben Affleck, Viola Davis, Chris Tucker, Jason Bateman, and Chris Messina. So tune into that and please rate, review, and subscribe.